Welcome to the Unipower Hazard Communication presentation. Today we will speak about hazard communication and the global harmonized system implemented by the United Nations back in 1992 and adopted in 2012 by OSHA. For decades, the Material Safety Data Sheets, or MSDS, has been the backbone of OSHA's hazard communication standards. Now, the hazard communication standard has been revised by OSHA to align with the globalized, harmonized system for classification and labeling of chemicals, or GHS. This will result in substantial changes to the MSDS. MSDS are documents normally many pages long that travel with or ahead of hazardous chemical shipments, warning users of specific dangers of such products and guidance for their safe handling, storage, and disposal. Maintaining an MSDS for every hazardous chemical and making them available to employees as part of the hazard communication standard right to know provisions, which says that employees have the right to know about chemicals which they're exposed to, is one of the 5 key responsibilities employers have under the hazard communication standards. The other 4 key responsibilities employees have are maintaining a hazard communication program detailing the plans in place for safe handling of chemicals, maintaining a written chemical inventory of every hazard chemical in the facility to which employees are exposed to, maintaining proper labels and warning signs associated with said chemicals, and finally training employees on chemical hazards and necessary precautions. In this presentation, we will discuss the new required way that chemicals need to be labeled and what these labels mean and how to read them. First, let's discuss what GHS is. The globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals, or GHS, is an internationally agreed upon system created by the United Nations. It's designed to replace the various classifications and labeling standards used in different countries by using consistent criteria for classification and labeling on a global level. GHS is a system of standardizing and harmonizing the classification and labeling of chemicals. It defines health and physical and environmental hazards of chemicals. And it also communicates hazard information as well as protective measures on labels and on safety data sheets. The reason for the GHS was that there were differences in the systems within different countries and within different regulatory agencies within the same countries. This led to inconsistent protection for those potentially exposed to the chemicals, as well as creating extensive regulatory burdens on companies producing the chemicals. Now, GHS itself is not a regulation or a standard. It established agreed hazard classifications and communication provisions with explanatory information on how to apply the system. GHS was developed to provide sound management of chemicals that include a system through which chemical hazards are identified and communicated to all who are potentially exposed. The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development issued a mandate calling for the development of GHS in 1992. Since the adoption of the mandate to create the GHS, OSHA has revised the hazard communication standard, aligning it with the GHS on March 26, 2012. The rule went into effect 60 days after the publication in the Federal Register. It is estimated that these new changes have prevented 43 fatalities and 521 injuries or illnesses annually. The first step of implementation was for employees to complete all training regarding new label elements and SDS format by December 1st, 2013. That was followed by the requirement of compliance for all provisions and the preparation of new labels and SDS by June 1st, 2015. The next step of implementation was for distributors to stop shipment of containers that did not have the GHS label, and this was to be completed by December 1st, 2015. Employers were given an additional year until June 1st, 2016 to update their hazard communication programs and any other workplace signs if applicable. The overall benefits of a GSS program is to ensure employers, employees, and the public are provided with adequate, practical, reliable, and comprehensible information on the hazards of chemicals so that they can take effective preventive and protective measures for their health and safety. Benefits to the workers and the public in general include the improved safety of workers and others through consistent and simplified communications on chemical hazards and practices to follow for safe handling and use, and greater awareness of hazards, resulting in safer use of chemicals in the workplace and in the home. Classification is a starting point for hazard communication. Chemicals are classified based on the type, the degree, and the severity of the hazard it poses. Manufacturers, under the revised hazard communication standard, are required to reevaluate chemicals according to the new criteria to make sure they're classified properly. This involves the identification of the hazard or hazards of a chemical or mixture by assigning a category of hazard/danger using a defined criteria. Hazard classes are subdivided into the categories of hazards. There are 16 classes of physical hazards, 10 classes of health hazards, and 3 classes of environmental hazards. Physical hazards include explosives, flammable gases, flammable aerosols, oxidizing gases, gases under pressure, flammable liquids, flammable solids, self-reactive substances, pyrophoric solids, pyrophoric liquids, self-heating substances, substances which in contact with water emit flammable gases, oxidizing liquids, oxidizing solids, organic peroxides, and corrosive to metals. Health hazards include acute toxicity, skin corrosion and irritation, serious eye damage or eye irritation, respiratory or skin sensitization, germ cell mutagenicity, carcinogenicity, reproductive toxicology, target organ systemic toxicity, single exposure, target organ systemic toxicity, repeated exposure, and aspiration toxicity. Environmental hazards include hazardous to the aquatic environment, acute aquatic toxicity, and chronic aquatic toxicity. Once a chemical has been classified, the hazard must be communicated to the target audiences. Labels and data sheets are the main tools for this chemical hazard communication. Label elements under the GHS system include product identifier, a signal word, usually danger or warning, a hazard statement, which is written for each class of hazard and category, pictograms for employees to easily identify the hazard, precautionary statement for each hazard and class category, and last but not least, the name and address and telephone of the chemical manufacturer. Signal words, such as danger or warning, are used to emphasize the hazard and indicate the relative level of severity of the hazard assigned to the GHS hazard class and category. Danger is used for the more severe hazards, warning for some that are less hazardous. Hazard statements are statements that are standardized and have assigned phrases that describe the hazard as determined by the hazard classification. Samples of hazard statements include causes eye irritation, toxic if inhaled, flammable aerosol, may cause cancer, may cause respiratory irritation, harmful to aquatic life, and contains gas under pressure, may explode if heated. Symbols or pictograms serve to attract attention to the health warning. One pictogram may be used to represent several hazards within the class. Some convey health, physical, and environmental hazards as assigned by the GHS hazard class and category. The GHS symbols have been incorporated into a pictogram to use on the GHS label. Pictograms will have a black symbol on a white background with a red diamond frame. The symbol below identifies a health hazard. The hazard might include carcinogen, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, respiratory sensitizer, target organ toxicity, and aspiration toxicity. The symbol below indicates an environmental hazard, specifically aquatic toxicity. The exclamation symbol indicates that the chemical is an irritant to the skin and eyes, is a skin sensitizer, has acute toxicity, has narcotic effects, is an irritant to respiratory tract, and is hazardous to the ozone layer. The skulls and crossbones symbol indicates that the chemical has acute toxicity that can be fatal or toxic. The gas cylinder symbol indicates that the gases are under pressure in the containers that hold the chemical being used. The symbol below indicates that the chemical in use has properties that can cause skin corrosion or burns, eye damage, and are corrosive to metals. The exploding bomb symbol indicates that the chemicals are explosives that are self-reactive and that are organic peroxides. The symbol of flames over a circle indicates that the chemicals are oxidizers. The symbol for flames indicates that the chemicals are flammable, pyrophorics, self-heating, they emit flammable gas, are self-reactive, and have organic peroxides. The symbols below indicate physical hazards for the chemicals in use in the workplace, including explosive, flame, corrosion, and gas cylinder. The symbols below indicate health hazards, including skulls and bones, corrosion, and the exclamation point. Precautionary statements are standardized explanations of the measures to be taken to minimize or prevent adverse effects. They include prevention, response, storage, and disposal of the chemicals. Below are some samples of precautionary statements. For prevention, wear protective gloves. For response, if inhaled, remove person to fresh air. For storage, store in well-ventilated place. For disposal, waste must be disposed of in accordance with federal, state, and local environmental control regulations. Below is a sample of a label placed into a chemical. First, number 1 identifies the product, sulfuric acid. Number 2 indicates the type of dangers that are associated with this chemical. It's corrosive and is dangerous. Number 3, signal word, danger. Number 4, hazard statements. May be harmful if swallowed, causes severe burns and eye damage, fatal if inhaled, harmful to aquatic life. Number 5 speaks about precautionary statements. Do not breathe dust, fumes, gas, mist, vapors, or spray. Wear protective gloves, protective clothing, eye protection, face protection. Wear respiratory protection. If in eyes, rinse cautiously with water for several minutes. Remove contact lens if present and easy to do. Continue to rinse. Immediately call for a poison control or doctor or physician. In case of fire, use water spray, alcohol-resistant foam, dry chemical, or carbon dioxide. Number 6, supplier information. Supplier information for this product is Sigma Aldrich. The address is 3050 Spruce Street, St. Louis, Missouri, 63103. The telephone number is 1-800-325-5832. Here is another example of GHS label. Notice the pictograms, the signal words, danger. Also notice the hazard statements, the precautionary statements, and the supplier information at the bottom. Secondary containers. Employers must ensure that each container of hazardous chemicals in the workplace is labeled, tagged, or marked with either the information specified in sections 1 through 5 for labels on shipped containers. Secondary containers information 1 through 5 include product identifier, signal word, hazard statements, pictograms, and precautionary statements. If the previous information is not available, product identifier and words, pictures, symbols, or a combination thereof, which provides at least general information regarding the hazards of the chemicals, and which, in conjunction with the other information immediately available to employees under the Hazard Communication Program, will provide employees with the specific information regarding the physical and health hazards of the hazardous chemical. Material Safety Data Sheets, or MSDS, have now changed to Safety Data Sheets, or SDS. SDS have several components. SDS now contain 16 sections that we will discuss. The first one being the identification of the substance or mixture and of the supplier, the hazards identification, the composition or information on the ingredients, first aid measures, firefighting measures, accidental release measures, handling and storage measures, and exposure to controls and personal protection. Additionally, the safety data sheets also include physical and chemical properties of the chemical, the stability and reactivity of the chemical, toxicology information, ecological information, disposal consideration, transport information, regulatory information, and other information, including information on preparation and revision of the SDS. Now we will discuss each of these sections in more detail. Section 1. Substance and Supplier Identification. This section identifies the chemical on the SDS as well as the recommended uses. It also provides the essential contact information of the supplier. Product identifier is used on the label and any other common names or synonyms by which the substance is known. The name, address, phone number of the manufacturer, importer, or other responsible party, as well as the emergency phone number. Section 2 talks about hazard identification. This section identifies the hazards of the chemical presented on the SDS and the appropriate warning information associated with those hazards, including the hazard classification of the chemical, the signal word, hazard statements, pictograms, precautionary statements, and a description of any hazard not otherwise classified. Section 3. Composition and information on ingredients. This section identifies the ingredients containing the product. This section includes information on substances, mixtures, and all chemicals where trade secret is claimed. It talks about the chemical name, the common name and synonyms. For mixtures, the chemical name and concentration, including exact percentages of all ingredients which are classified as health hazards. It also includes the chemical abstract service number and other unique identifiers. Section 4. First aid measures. This section describes the initial care that should be given by untrained responders to an individual who has been exposed to the chemical. It includes the necessary first aid instructions by relevant routes of exposure: inhalation, skin and eye contact, and ingestion. It also speaks in reference to the description of the most important symptoms or effects and any symptoms that are acute or delayed. Finally, it talks about the recommendations for immediate medical care and special treatment needed when necessary. Section 5 talks about firefighting measures. This section provides recommendations for fighting a fire caused by the chemical. Recommendations include recommendations of suitable extinguishing equipment and information about extinguishing equipment that is not appropriate for a particular situation. It also provides advice on specific hazards that develop from the chemical during the fire, such as any hazardous combustion product created when the chemical burns. Finally, it provides recommendations on special protective equipment or precautions for firefighters. Section 6. Accidental Release Measures. This section provides recommendations on the appropriate response to spills, leaks, or releases, including contaminant and cleanup practices to prevent or minimize exposure to people, properties, or the environment. Some of these recommendations include the use of personal precautions and protective equipment, emergency procedures and appropriate protective clothing, methods and materials used for containment, and cleanup procedures, including appropriate techniques for neutralization, decontamination, cleaning or vacuuming absorbent material, and or equipment required for containment or cleanup. Section 7 talks about handling and storage of chemicals. This section provides guidance on the safe handling and practices and conditions for safe storage of chemicals. This section includes precautions on safe handling, including recommendations for handling incompatible chemicals, minimizing the release of the chemicals into the environment, and providing advice on general hygiene practices, including eating, drinking, and smoking in the workplace that is prohibited. Additionally, recommendations on the conditions for safe storage includes any incompatibilities. Section 8. Exposure controls and personal protection. This section indicates the exposure limits, engineering controls, and personal protective measures that can be used to minimize worst exposure. OSHA's Permissible Exposure Limits, or PELs, the American Conference of Government Industrial Hygienists, threshold limit values, and any other exposure limit used or recommended by the chemical manufacturers are explained in this section. This section also talks about appropriate engineering controls and makes recommendations for personal protective measures to prevent illness or injury from exposure to chemicals. Finally, this section talks about any special requirements for personal protective equipment, protective clothing, or respirators. Section 9. Physical and chemical properties. This section identifies physical and chemical properties associated with a substance or mixture, including but not limited to appearance, upper and lower flammability and explosive limits, odor, vapor pressure, vapor density, pH level, and flash point. Section 10 speaks about stability and reactivity of the chemical. This section describes the reactivity hazards of the chemical and the chemical stability information, which includes the description of the test data for the chemical, indication of whether the chemical is stable or unstable under normal ambient temperature and conditions while in storage and being handled, and a list of all conditions that should be avoided and all class of incompatible materials with which the chemical could react to produce a hazardous situation. Section 11. Toxicological information. This section identifies toxicological information and health effects information or indicates that such data are not available. This section identifies information on the likely route for exposure, describes the delayed, immediate, and chronic effects of short and long-term exposure to the chemical, the numerical measures of toxicity, acute toxicity estimates such as LD50 for medium lethal dose. It also describes descriptions of symptoms and gives indication on whether the chemical is listed in the National Toxicology Program or the International Agency for Research on Cancer monographs, or found to be potentially carcinogen by OSHA. Section 12, Ecological Information. This section provides information to evaluate the environment impact of the chemical if it were released to the environment. It includes data from toxicity tests performed on aquatic organisms, whether there is a potential for the chemical to persist and degrade in the environment, the results of the test of bioaccumulation potential, the potential for a substance to move from the soil to the groundwater, and other adverse effects. Section 13, Disposal Considerations. This section provides guidance on proper disposal practices, recycling or reclamation of the chemical or its container, and the safe handling practices. It also includes description of appropriate disposal containers to use, recommendations of appropriate disposal methods to employ, description of the physical or chemical properties that may affect disposal activities, language discouraging sewage disposal, and any special precautions for landfills or incineration activities. Section 14, Transportation Information. This section provides guidance on the classification information for shipping and transporting of hazardous materials by road, air, rail, or sea. It includes a UN number, a UN proper shipping name, transport hazard classes, packing group number, and any special precautions which an employee should be aware of or needs to comply with in connection with transport or conveyance either within or outside the premises. Section 15, Regulatory Information. This section identifies the safety, health, and environmental regulations specific to the product that is not indicated anywhere else on the safety data sheet. Any national or regional regulatory information of the chemical or mixtures, including any OSHA, Department of Transportation, EPA, or Consumer Product Safety Commission regulations, are included in this section. Section 16, Other Information. In preparing an SDS, the chemical manufacturer may become aware of significant information regarding the hazards of the chemical or ways to protect against the hazard, and this new information must be added to the SDS within 3 months. They get 6 months to update the labels. This section, Section 16, indicates when the SDS was prepared, when the last known revision was made, and other useful information that may need to be included in here. So what have we learned in this presentation? The existing OSHA MSDS system of identifying materials, their properties, potential hazards, and handling methods has been updated to the universal GHS system, which includes the new safety data sheets. Hazard communication for materials has been standardized around the world. This provides for the classification of chemicals, specifies labeling requirements, and defines any health, physical, and environmental hazards for these chemicals. Additionally, this hazard communication standard further defines how this information for potential hazards is to be communicated on labels, as well as protective measures to be taken. You have seen examples of these labels that will be used to identify these materials and how these materials are classified for the potential hazards they might present. You have seen the information on handling and the necessary exposure precautions and remedies. Finally, this hazard communication program is required training for all employees, enabling them to identify potential hazards and the precautions to be taken when handling, using, and being exposed to these materials. We want to assure you that Unipower will do everything in its power to ensure a working, safe environment for all. Thank you for participating in this important training.